the mast cells are sensing every thought about whether we're safe or not safe. They're monitoring that. So if I have a thought about, oh my gosh, I've got to get up, I've got to get the kids off to school, and then I've got to get myself ready for work. I got to get to work. I'm in rush hour traffic. I got to get home. I got to get them fed. They got to get homework. They got extracurriculars. And I haven't had a breath all day long. That in itself is a trigger.
Let's ditch the quick fix and dive into today's conversation. Welcome, everybody. My guest today is Beth O'Hara. Beth works with clients who suffer from Mast Cell Activation Syndrome. She is a functional naturopath, a functional genetic analyst. She has a doctorate in naturopathy, specializing in functional naturopathic approaches, and a master's in marriage and family therapy. She found her own root causes to her Mast Cell Activation Syndrome and has been able to heal. After decades of seeing traditional healthcare practitioners, Beth felt like she was at the end of her rope. The medications often made her feel worse, and taking the wrong supplements didn't help either. Finally, she discovered a three-part approach that helped her get well: genetic analysis, functional naturopathy, and emotional wellness. These things all allowed her body to heal. And since then, her passion is working with others with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome to find their root causes and support their healing. Welcome, Beth. It's really a privilege and an honor to have you here today. You've got so much to share, and we'll try to hit some really high points on Mast Cell Activation Syndrome. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And this is such a critical conversation because many people don't even realize this is what they've been dealing with all these mystery symptoms. But up to 17% of the general population has Mast Cell Activation Syndrome. And those studies came pre-COVID. So we know that's been a big trigger, and those numbers are likely higher. That's about 50 million Americans.
It's huge. Very huge. And it's a relatively new diagnosis, right?
That's right.
It's only within the last 6-7 years that it's actually been defined.
Yes, it was in theoretical phases for a long time. It finally got a diagnosis code in 2016. The diagnostic criteria is still being debated, and it's still not taught in medical schools.
That's interesting. So I'd love to touch on that a little bit of detail. But before, maybe kind of share how you have become so familiar with it, your history that has led you to be basically an expert. I think one of the best experts out there on Mast Cell Activation Syndrome.
Thank you so much. I stand on the shoulder of giants, so there's been a lot of people that
Stepping stones,
and that I'm grateful for, all the research that's come along. But when I was dealing with all this, we had no clue what was happening. And my symptoms started in childhood. I would be covered head to toe in hives, scratching my skin off. I'd be scratching till it was, bled. My eyes were always itching. And there was a number of things that were leading to this. So we moved into an old farmhouse when I was 7. Nobody knew anything about toxic mold back then. A lot of people don't know anything about mold now, and mold is an epidemic issue as well. And we had moved out to the country, so I had all these tick bites, and I didn't think about it. You're a kid, you're playing out in the woods, and you get bit by ticks. It's just part of life. And we didn't know anything about Lyme or those co-infections either. So I had both of those from a young age, and then I was kicked in the head by a horse when I was 9 and had a traumatic brain injury. So I developed severe insomnia. I developed extreme anxiety, social phobia, and trouble relating to people, interacting, communicating. But we fast forward some. I was really good at school, and I was on track to go to medical school, and I wanted to go into neurology. And I had worked my tail off. I had multiple scholarship offers to medical school, which were hard to get. But my health, the harder I worked, the more I declined. And by my senior year in college, I could barely get out of bed. I was so chronically fatigued. I had fibromyalgia, severe muscle pain. I was developing joint pain. And I knew at that point that even if I've made it through the coursework, which is grueling, I would never make the 80-hour-a-week residency for 4 to 6 years, longer for neurology.
Right.
And I had to turn those scholarships down. It was one of the most devastating things of my whole life to see
Oh
these
boy.
dreams I had, and I didn't have a backup plan. That's all I wanted to do. So see this all go up in smoke. And I, instead of becoming a neurologist, became a chronically ill patient.
Boy.
And I had already seen a few providers, and I just started making the circuits because I was desperate. My life was whittling smaller and smaller. I exhausted everything functional medicine had to offer. I started into holistic medicine, and then functional medicine was just getting its start. And this was way before we had telemed. So we didn't have access to all the people, so who you could drive to.
Sure.
And by the time I was 28, I was barely hobbling with a cane. I couldn't hardly walk from my joints felt like I was walking on ground glass. It was excruciating.
Oh my goodness.
And my brain, I went from doing graduate school coursework and independent study research to not being able to read a book. I couldn't process left or right. I would get lost all the time. I probably shouldn't have been driving
Oh,
because I couldn't figure out which way to turn. Even once we got GPSs, I couldn't make sense of it. And that's how severe the brain fog was. And there was so much. I mean, there was skin crawling. I had these internal vibrations. I felt like there was an earthquake, like a low grade earthquake, but I could see nothing was moving. So it didn't make sense to me why there was this internal vibration that would come and go. And my GI tract was just a mess. I had chronic diarrhea. I had acid reflux. Eventually, I became so sensitive. I got down to only 10 foods I could tolerate, lost a lot of weight. I eventually couldn't tolerate medications or even a little sprinkle of something like quercetin that should be anti-inflammatory.
right.
Or curcumin especially would make me inflamed and anxious and make me flush. And things like GABA would make me more anxious, which should be calming. So nothing was
The
making
opposite reaction.
I having all these paradoxical reactions. And then I mean, I even tried things like homeopathy. I tried shamanic work. I was told numerous times that either I was the most sensitive person the practitioner had ever seen, and they didn't know what to do. That was the compassionate response. Or I was told I was crazy and my lab work was normal and it was all in my head, and referral to psychiatry. And I share these parts of my story. I don't have the trauma around it anymore that I used to, but so many people have the same experiences. And that's why I want people to know they're not alone in that.
If you've listened to this podcast, you know how often ozone therapy comes up. I personally have the Simply O3 Complete Kit and use it as a preventative measure or when I come down with something. So whether it's ozone therapy at home or in your clinic, Simply O3 has equipment for your needs. If you are healing chronic illness or biohacking for optimal health, Simply O3 will make getting started with ozone therapy super easy. Go to simplyO3.com or call 844-655-2524. Use code FIX to get 10% off. That's www.simplyo as in oxygen 3.com. Yes.
And that a lot of times when you're dealing with these things, you think you're the only one. You know, I was the sickest person I'd ever met, the most sensitive. And then all these brilliant practitioners were telling me, I've never seen anybody like you. I don't know. I'm just throwing my hands up. I don't know what to do. The real turning point came, Damon, when I had seen, I mean, somewhere along the course, I had seen over 75 practitioners. And if I'm anything, I'm tenacious. And so I knew in my core that there was an answer out there. I didn't know if I'd find it in time, but I knew it was there. I don't know how I knew, but I just knew. And the most experienced advanced functional medicine practitioner in my area, it took me an hour to drive to him, it took me a week to recover from that.
Just from the journey.
Just from the trip there and
Yes.
then an hour back.
Yes.
And he I remember the day still that he said, we'd been working together maybe 3 years. And he said, Beth, I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to do. Everything we try makes you worse. And I really don't know. And at this point, I had figured out I had histamine intolerance and I'd learned about mast cell activation syndrome. So we knew I had that going, but we were way in the early stages of figuring out what to do about it. And I sobbed. I mean, I sobbed the whole day.
Hmm.
And I was terrified because if he didn't know, who's going to know? And then with at least I have that tenacity. And I woke up the next morning and I pulled my bootstraps up and said, I'm going to figure this out.
Boy.
And I had the pre-med background and every moment my brain worked, even if all I could do was read 2 sentences of a research paper, I would read that and try to figure out what it said. And I started digging through books. And what it all came down to was I had massive triggers. I had the previous brain injury. I had Lyme, Bartonella, and Babesia. I had mold toxicity. I was still being exposed to mold and I didn't know it because it wasn't visible, and it's usually not visible. And then I'd had, trauma around that brain injury and some other things in my past. So that was unresolved, and structural issues with my neck. So I had every root trigger just about that you can have. Once we started unraveling that, then I learned to start, since I was so sensitive, to start with my nervous system and calm that down. And that really came from the work of Dr. Neil Nathan. And
Okay.
that changed my life. And I got things back on track and I got back to where I could tolerate things. I got my health back. I went back to graduate school later in life and I got my graduate degrees and built this practice. And I just want to tell people today, I mean, I just went hiking for 3 or 4 miles. I just got back from visiting my husband's grandchildren, and they just turned 2, the twin boys, and I was able to pick them up and carry them around. And the birthday party and had the energy for that, and I felt good. And I really have a good life and a normal life, except I take a lot of care of my health, much more than most people. But uh,
So what time frame was that? I mean, you're kind of in school and this starts happening and you kind of have to, like you said, you goes up in smoke. How many years from that point to when you started saying, "Hey, I'm finally got my life back"?
I would say I really started getting sick about age 8. And things really started turning around. It was about 20 years.
Yeah, to
So
really get on the right track.
20 years. And I stopped counting at about $350,000. I poured, and I was not a wealthy person. I'm not a wealthy person, but I poured every penny into my health.
Mhm.
And the good news is, and I really want to share with people, that if you're dealing with this, we know what to do now. We know how to address this. And it's a whole different, not even ball game, it's a whole different ball field that we're in. And people can get better within 2 to 5 years. It
A
costs
lot
them
more
way
efficient.
less, so much more efficient. That's my mission today. If I can take that nightmare and help people have an easier life now, that makes it worth it, what I went through.
Absolutely. And that's so important. I mean, you basically, like you said earlier that, you've been standing on the shoulders of giants and stepping stones, but also you're one now. I mean, you've been through the battle and you're going to continue to help people get through the battle with less, stress and difficulty. And that's so huge. So just a quick circle back. What is the diagnostic criteria for mast cell activation syndrome? You said it's still kind of in flux, but what is kind of the diagnostic criteria for it in a general sense?
Maybe we should back up a little more even and talk about what mast cells are, so that
Perfect.
makes sense, why
Perfect.
that's the criteria. And then what is mast cell activation syndrome? So these mast cells are some of our most important immune cells in our bodies, and they are frontline defending and sensing cells. They're sensing for danger, they're sensing for safety, and they're also involved in things like sleep-wake cycles, wound healing, pregnancy. They have a lot of roles. But in the context of mast cell activation syndrome, I want to focus on the sensing for safety and danger. And they are located in every tissue in our bodies except the retinas. So everywhere. And just to sense the gravity of what that means, I want to go through some of those tissues. So they're in all through our skin in high numbers. They're in the GI tract, from the mouth down the esophagus, stomach, the intestines. So this is important to think about in terms of why the symptoms show up the way they do. They're in the tissues around the eyes, inside the ears, the whole respiratory tract. So they line the nose, inside the nose, the sinuses, down the trachea, into the lungs. They're in the lungs. They're in the heart. They're in all of the major organs. They're in the thyroid. They're in the pancreas. They're in the liver. They're in the bladder. They're in the kidneys. And they are, and this is very, very important, they line every nerve sheath and they're at every nerve ending. So they're really interwoven with the nervous system, and they're the interface between the nervous system and communicating with the rest of the body. And there's actually a continual crosstalk between the mast cells and the nervous system. This is why stress is such a huge factor and we underestimate it. So I'm going to come back to that. And the mast cells have these receptors on the outside to sense for pathogens like viruses and bacteria, molds, candida, parasites. They sense for chemicals, whether it's that fragrance in the laundry aisle. And if you've got to hold your breath to walk down that laundry aisle, not everybody with mast cell activation has to do that, but if you do, you should definitely consider it. And they're sensing for all kinds of glyphosate, all these chemicals, hormones in our bodies, neurotransmitters. And we could spend a whole podcast just talking about that.
Yes.
And then inside them, there are over 1,000 different chemicals called mediators that they can release selectively, depending on what's going on, or all at once, and it's called degranulation. So when those chemicals inside, the one people know the best is histamine. And people think about antihistamines. Well, that helps block the histamine release from these mast cells.
Mm-hmm.
But they also produce cytokines. That's a household name now, or a household word. So they're part of this communication network of cytokines, and they're involved in cytokine storms. They produce all kinds of other ones, prostaglandin, substance P, things people may have heard of. And they also produce neurotransmitters and neuropeptides, interestingly. So in normal activity, here's an example. You twist your ankle, it gets red and hot, and there's an inflammatory response. It's a healing response.
Right.
The mast cells are part of escalating that, initiating that, and then it comes back down and you're just fine. And then 6 weeks later, you totally forgot you sprained your ankle, you never think of it again. Or similar, if you cut your finger, you don't get cleaned out, and then the mast cells clean that up for you.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened with mast cell activation syndrome is that the mast cells don't get a break anymore. So we live in a world that's more toxic than we've ever lived in human history.
So higher activation.
Constant activation. So if we think about these different kinds of triggers, 200 years ago, we might get triggered by, there was a mountain lion and I got away, and then everything can settle back down and I'm going to be fine.
Right.
We were kind of in the Industrial Revolution, so there's starting to be some chemical triggers then for people who were in the cities, but otherwise we didn't have a lot of them. Maybe you got meat that was too old or something like that, or you caught a virus. So if we think about the mast cells as being the guards of the castle gate of us, then they should be able to be on duty and then take a break, and be on duty and take a break and re-regulate and reset. We don't get a break anymore. So we're exposed to more chemicals than we've ever been exposed to in human history. And we have combinations of chemicals happening environmentally. We don't even know what they are, what they do.
Right.
Babies are born with chemicals in their cord blood. We have metals at levels we haven't had. Mold is an epidemic that we've always had mold, but not at these levels. EMFs at the levels, Lyme at these levels. Now we have COVID to add to it.
Right.
And stressors. I mean, just the kind of lives we live compared to the pacing 200 years ago, or even our grandparents' pacing.
Sure.
It's just lightning speed. And with the mast cells are sensing every thought about whether we're safe or not safe. They're monitoring that. So if I have a thought about, oh my gosh, I've got to get up, I've got to get the kids off to school, and then I've got to get myself ready for work. I got to get to work. I'm in rush hour traffic. I got to get home. I got to get them fed. They got to get homework. They got extracurriculars. And I haven't had a breath all day long. That in itself is a trigger. And mast cell activation syndrome is when the mast cells become dysregulated and they can't regulate themselves anymore. So officially it's called a multisystemic, meaning it affects at least two systems, like GI in the skin or GI in the nervous system, the brain, respiratory. It's with or without allergies. So not everybody has seasonal allergies, but just seasonal allergies is not mast cell activation syndrome. That's all you have. But if you have seasonal allergies and brain fog and chronic fatigue and muscle pain, okay, then we're maybe in the ballpark.
Multi-system.
Multi-system. And it's with or without anaphylaxis.
Okay.
And anaphylaxis being when we have an extreme reaction where we have trouble breathing, throat closing, we can get faint, we can pass out, blood pressure drops. And then the diagnostic criteria that's in flux is quite debated, but it's at a core, either have to be symptoms that match in 2 or more systems. And there's over 100 symptoms possibilities. So I have a symptom survey people can take, we can talk about, that's free. And then there's blood testing. You have to meet one of those blood markers. The problem with those is that there's only about 10 that can be tested for, and there's over 1,000 mediators.
Oh boy.
So are we testing for the ones that are elevated? And then that has to be handled properly. And the labs have to cold centrifuge it. Very few labs have cold centrifuge, and it has to be kept chilled the whole time. So it's usually not processed correctly. If it is, we have a much better chance of catching it. But I think most people are being missed because of this. And then there has to be a positive response to a mast cell stabilizing medication or an antihistamine, but most of those have triggers in them that are mast cell triggers like dyes or titanium dioxide, talc, cornstarch. So
yeah,
this is still going through evolution. It will get better over time.
Yeah, the process still has to be sophisticated to meet. Yeah, when you're only hitting 10 out of 1,000, yeah, you've got to be missing people. And then if it's not processed correctly, to process those 10,
yeah,
what a challenge. So basically, the mast cell activation can develop in all kinds of different scenarios, like you said, Lyme's with mold, and the histamine connection specifically is often from all those different triggers, right?
It can be. Not everybody actually has issues with histamine, interestingly, that have mast cell activation syndrome. But if they do, they're much more likely to have also histamine intolerance, where you have trouble breaking down the excess histamine. And then the symptoms are going to be even more extreme.
And so kind of maybe dig a little bit deeper into the mold element. I know that's one that you've kind of touched on a little bit, but if you can dig a little bit deeper on it. The mold, how is the mold really triggering it? What are the approaches to try to deal with mold? I mean, obviously there's remediation in the home and all that type of stuff, but what about just a human approach to trying to deal with mold?
Now, mold is, in my experience, I've worked with, we're coming up closer to 1,000 cases at this point. And then we've had thousands of people have taken our courses and reported back how that's gone for them in terms of the method that we're using.
Gotcha.
So fortunately, we have quite a lot of evidence now about how this is working. Mold, we're seeing, has been the #1 root trigger for mast cell activation syndrome. Now, I don't meet anybody with only one trigger, but it's one of the biggest that keep people stuck and one of the most overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
And that very close second are the tick-borne infections,
Okay.
Lyme and things like Bartonella, those co-infections. When there's both, and it's not, and people have so many other things. They have Epstein-Barr, they have parasites, they have SIBO, they have all this stuff. When there's mold, that's the first layer to address. And the reason is because mold is neurotoxic, so it's toxic to the nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
and it contributes to all these sensitivities. And so will stress and trauma as well, because of that nervous system mast cell integration I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And mold dysregulates the immune system tremendously to where you can't fight off Lyme or Epstein-Barr, and the treatments don't work because the treatments have to work along with the immune system. So this is where we get people on years and years of IV antibiotics or oral antibiotics. They can't get off. Every time they get off, everything flares up. There's something underneath that's holding it all stuck, and time again, we see that it's mold toxicity.
Gotcha.
So it is highly triggering to the mast cells. They have particular receptors just for things like molds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's toxic to every system in our body. That people really underestimate how serious mold toxins are. Honestly, at least for my own case, if I went back again and got to choose, but I had to choose Lyme or mold, I would have Lyme again and not have mold because of
Wow.
how destructive it is.
That's a powerful statement.
It is, I know. And the other part of this is that when mold colonizes in our bodies, meaning it can enter us and grow in us, it's different than when a bacteria or virus is in our body. So bacteria or virus wants to weaken the host, but it only stays alive if you stay alive. Molds are in a whole different, viruses and bacteria have the different kingdoms. Mold is in the fungal kingdom. And if we think about when we see molds either on a piece of bread or a piece of fruit or out in nature, what are they doing? They're decomposing. We have clear evidence that's what they're doing inside our bodies as well. They release these particular enzymes like hydrolases, proteases. They break down our tissues. They decompose it to get the nutrients out. That's why I'd rather have Lyme again.
Yeah, boy, that's big. So, what are some of the healing strategies, that you've incorporated for, the different triggers, the different combinations of triggers, things of that nature, and then maybe we can kind of get into, what are some of the first steps that people that might have mast cell activation syndrome need to take. But what are some of the basic treatment approaches to trying to address the different triggers and different causes?
Yeah, so I'll stay with mold first, and then we'll zoom out because people don't start with mold. But yeah, let's talk about mold, and then we'll zoom out to what that looks like in
Sure.
the context of the whole method. Just with the mold, the first thing is actually to get testing and to
Mm-hmm.
find out which toxins you're dealing with. And the reason that's important is because from our both from the studies, the research studies, there's a huge volume of studies on this.
Mm-hmm.
And from clinical experience, we find that different binders bind more selectively to different toxins. I know there's a lot of supplement companies out there that do a wonderful job of marketing a single combo binder. And it would be
Mm-hmm.
great if a single combo binder that has like some charcoal and some aloe or zeolite or whatever's in there, and there's lots of products. It would be wonderful there was one that just would clear it across the board. At least in my clinic, I don't see those working alone. I can see them working in combo, but not alone. We want to target, so I call this precision mycotoxin binding. We want to target, if I have ochratoxin, I know I need to take charcoal as one of those.
Okay.
Actually, Wellcall is a prescription binder. It's a bile binder. That's one of the better ones for ochratoxin.
Okay.
And I can't just rely on, say, Saccharomyces boulardii. That's a probiotic, but That is a better binder for toxins like gliotoxin and aflatoxin. Doesn't work for ochratoxin as far as we know. So that's
Okay.
what I mean by targeting it.
Sure.
So we start with binders and just kind of bring the load down and start with supporting the just overall lowering the load of the toxins in general. So some kidney support, some lymph support, some liver supports. We do that for a while before we go into antimicrobials if there's colonization, like in the sinuses, the GI tract, which is about 70% adults have that have mold issues. And then after a while of getting that load down, then we'll go into the killing phase we think of.
Okay.
You'll see protocols out there that start with the killing phase and then bring the binders in later. And I find that doesn't work well in mast cell activation syndrome because
Okay.
you kill these microbes off, these molds. They're going to release toxins as they die. So you're just adding to the toxic soup somebody's sitting in. We got to clear it out before we add more to the pile, basically. One of the things I love at that stage with sinus colonization, I use myself, is sinus insufflation of ozone.
Okay.
And I really like how you can work with a very low gamma. People can work themselves up slowly. They can do it at home. That's a wonderful method. And they can do ear insufflation as well, especially if there's some ear symptoms, like sometimes people get itchy ears or fullness in here.
Very good. Yeah. So ozone has some pretty good antimicrobial kind of aspects to it. It's an oxidative stress in playing that game of trying to do a little bit of stress, but not too much to get the right reaction, right?
Right, exactly. And it's just effective for, along with some of the nasal sprays, when we add that in, you get quicker clearing of the sinus colonization.
Yeah. Yeah, I find ozone to be a very positive, something I use as well, as I was sharing before we started recording. But also I think, really try to hit a lot. You mentioned it a little bit earlier on trying to calm the nervous system, trying to get into that vagus nerve, limbic system kind of area. What are some of the strategies there? Or am I jumping ahead of things?
Well, why don't I talk about the overall picture and then go into some specific strategies? So
Okay.
I developed and really tested over the years what I call the MC360 method.
Okay.
It's been
I was
really
going to ask you
influenced
about that.
by my mentors, Neil Nathan, Jill Krista. And in this method, and this works really well for sensitive people who are having trouble tolerating things, they keep trying to detox and it's not working for them, then what we do is we start with the stabilization phase before we ever detox. And in that phase, we're calming the nervous system, we're calming the mast cells, we're removing the triggers. So if there's environmental exposure to mold, we're working through that. If they're still using those Glade fragrance plugins, those got to go.
Ooh,
Terrible
yeah.
for everybody.
Yes.
If we're using conventional cleaning products and bleach, we're looking for those triggers.
Hmm.
And they're hitting people day to day, and emotional triggers. It's amazing how many people with chronic illness are in relationships with somebody who's really toxic.
Hmm.
And it's just constantly feels unsafe. And the whole picture of getting out of mast cell activation syndrome, and we really could turn this around. There's remarkable turnarounds. The whole context of that is we have to feel safe, physically safe, emotionally safe, and biochemically safe from these pathogens and toxins.
Right.
Then we're going to do some adrenal balancing. We're going to make sure we're optimizing sleep the best that we can, which is always a moving target when you're dealing with mold and you're dealing with these pathogen layers like tick-borne infections. That can take people, depending on how much they've already worked on it. When I see them, or somebody in our practice, one of our practitioners sees them, that can take them anywhere from 3 months, that phase. Some people, the mold remediation is a long time. It might take them a year or two. So we just work on that. And then once our symptoms come down a few notches, we're going to go into a gentle detox. We may not be done with the mold remediation, but people need to at least get on some binders if they're exposed to
Hmm.
mold.
Hmm.
Then we're going to detox, what I was talking about. And we start with the mold. Then as we're hitting the antimicrobial phase for the mold, we're also going to start looking at these other pathogen layers. So
Okay.
that can be the tick-borne layers. At that point, we have a chance of clearing up SIBO and SIFO, which almost never clears up before then in this population. So I can only talk to this about this population I work with. It's not for everybody.
Sure.
And then after that, we move into rebuilding the body. We can rebuild our GI tract lining. We can rebuild things like our bone health, our bone strength, things that were being connective tissue, things that were being broken down. And then we optimize for health and wellness and get people on a pared down plan and what will really support them based on their genetics and their history. We go back to the stabilization. That's where we spend the most time. And it's the most important first step for people. And I'm going to hit on just some highlights, but I have some courses people can really dive into. And in the nervous system part, we want to work on two systems, the limbic system and the vagal nerve. And a lot of people tell me, oh, well, I'm doing this great meditation, or I'm doing the Calm app or the Headspace app. That's wonderful. Please keep doing it. And we have to target those two systems. So limbic system are things like Annie Hopper's DNRS or Asha Gupta's Gupta program, very effective for that. And then the vagal nerve, there's different things. There's hands-on work with like an osteopathic cranial therapist. I just got to try out the Alpha Stem. That was really nice. Where you put this on your earlobes and it gives you a light current.
Okay.
And we use a lot of Brain Tap, which is a listening program. We'd have people do things like emotional freedom technique, which is using acupressure points. As many vagal supports as we can get on board, the better people will do. And then we're going to bring in mast cell supports. So these can be like your typical, which would be things like quercetin, but not everybody tolerates that. Sometimes I start with baking soda because that modulates inflammation, and sometimes that's all people can tolerate. I love things like perilla seed extract, bacolin, which is Chinese skullcap extract. Sometimes people have salicylate intolerance, so we go more with the nutrients, zinc and vitamin E, vitamin C. So it's really case by case, but we've got a whole toolkit of what people can get on board.
Boy, and I highly recommend people do check into what you have available, because you have such good information and good programs. So sometimes people can get in trouble by trying to do too much too soon, is kind of what I'm hearing here. Is that?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So
I use the metaphor a lot of the tortoise and the hare, and the hare runs off the cliff and falls down and never makes it. The tortoise, slow and steady. So most adults, like I said at the beginning, can be done depending on the complexity. Really short end would be about 18 months. I'm not seeing the easy cases. We get really complex cases. So we're usually looking between 2 to 2.5 years to upwards on a very complex case. It might be 5 or 6 years. That's much shorter than 20 years. I know it's a long time, but it's much less than 20.
Boy, yeah, it's a huge difference. The whole idea with this particular podcast, is ditching the quick fix, and that really is hitting the essence of what that means. We're just too used to trying to get something too quick, and not really realizing it took a long time for a lot of us. Took a long time. Like when you look at your background and all the different exposures and the traumatic brain injury and the different things, and then things just kept on festering until you're at graduate school and you're going, man, I am not able to go past this point. You can't turn that around,
right,
in an immediate kind of sense. It just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, not in the cases we see.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I know there are cases of spontaneous healing, and I think that's wonderful. But we get the people who keep falling through the cracks, and that's what our clinic is based on. But the people who stick with the program, we have about a 95% success rate of people see it through. It's a lot of work, but it works.
So maybe, getting a little bit close to kind of wrapping up here, but want to take a little bit more time, maybe just highlighting some of your courses, and maybe you could kind of talk a little bit about what you have available for people who work with you and just kind of visit your website.
Yeah, I would love to. So we have 3 courses, and the first one, if people are I'll talk about who they're for.
Okay.
So for people who are really sensitive and not tolerating medications or supplements, nothing's working. The first step is to take what is called the mast cell nervous system reboot. And this is a nervous system course that goes into how do you pick from all the modalities that are out there? How do you really build something that works for you? Now, it's not a one-stop shop, but what it is I take you through a number of free exercises you can start to incorporate daily. And one is emotional freedom technique with the tapping. I teach how to do that. And there's 7 different exercises that work on helping the nervous system. And it's really targeted this mast cell nervous system axis. And then I take you through, there's a self-assessment and how do you know how much limbic and vagal work to bring on board. And I go over your different options for limbic work, how to choose, for vagal work, how to choose, put your program together. And you build your own roadmap. So it's really self-paced. We've had great feedback as long as people understand that it's not meant to be an all-inclusive program.
Right.
And there's some, for practitioners, a lot of practitioners have taken that and they really like the science modules in there where I go into depth about why this works and how this works and why it's important. And that's also for the health geeks who like to listen to podcasts like this. They really like that. Then I have my top 8 mast cell supporting supplements masterclass. That's geared towards people who are just getting started. They can tolerate taking some things, but they don't have time yet, or they're not invested yet in doing this for the long haul. They just, this is the super busy CEO who's maybe not that sick, or it's for somebody who is a health geek and they just want all the information. Then a lot of people take all of these. But that's a short course. It's about 2 hours. Takes you through the different uses of the supplements. And I talk about some low salicylate options as well. And then I have my precision, MC360 precision mold detox course. And this is really, you can think of our flagship course. And there's 2 levels on this. There's the basic level for people who are quite brain fogged. They are newer into this area and they need it in more basic language and broken down into simple steps. And that takes them through how to test yourself for mold using the urine tests, what they mean, how to interpret them for yourself, how to get yourself started on binders, how to support your liver, your kidneys, and your lymph system. And I talk about in there testing your home for mold and mold remediation. Then I have the advanced level, and that's for the practitioners and that's for the health geeks, like people who really love this podcast and love getting all this kind of information, and they want to get all the nuances. So that goes in more depth. They get everything I just talked about in the basic. Then there's advanced modules in the binders, advanced modules in the liver and lymph and kidney supports, and it takes them into the antimicrobials. And that takes somebody who really put some critical thinking. So that's why I put it in the advanced. There are case studies and there's a lot of troubleshooting, like getting past stubborn constipation and how to handle that with binders.
Sure.
Pregnancy, breastfeeding, all of those nuances. And we have three fairly different cases. There's a teenage case, there's a person with a lot of salicylate intolerance, and then there was somebody who was quite severe. And how did we work them through and what worked for them from beginning to end? So even starting with their nervous system work, what did we do for the mast cells? What was their exact protocol for the mold? So those are the course options, and people can jump in any of them.
Very, very good. And then you also have the potential to work with you or other practitioners within your program.
That's right. So we do have a clinic, and we are in the process of expanding so we can get more people more quickly because we have quite a wait right now. But people can apply, and that's at mastcell360.com/application.
Okay.
And so our website's Mast Cell 360, and that's where they'll find all the blog resources. They'll find the courses listed there, and then they can find the application. If you put an application in, there's no deposit, there's no obligation, but it gets you in the queue.
Okay.
And as we're getting a couple more practitioners right now onboarded, which I'm so excited about.
That's very, very, very good. So with the way you have it set up, even if you're in the queue, you've got this opportunity to kind of study, get started on your own.
Yes.
If you want to do, work with a practitioner, you've got this opportunity to kind of get prepared for that.
That's what we prefer is if people are coming in, they do get some starting steps. So we're already down the road when we get going. But I know not everybody has the same budget. So it's been really important to me to have different level offerings for people based on what they can afford.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, that's really, really good. So, pretty much everything is a good take home point, but how would you summarize just, maybe one or two take home points, as we get close to wrapping up here?
The most important is that if you have been going doctor to doctor to doctor and you still have all these mystery pieces, this is very important to look at. And if there's any kind of autoimmunity, any cancer history, any chronic inflammation that's not injury related, that and simple, this is important. There's a symptom survey on our website you can find in the menu, and it's free. Just take yourself through there and see, does this match?
Okay.
No matter what people are dealing with, and you may or may not get a diagnosis. I think only about 10% of people are getting diagnosed that have this. Regardless, what we have built works. And the most important thing is to never give up. If I had given up, I probably wouldn't be here today. And I know I wouldn't be sitting with you, but I may not be here on this earth today. And the most important thing is, this is a hard journey, is every morning, remember what you're grateful for. Remember that there's always another door to open. And if you keep going, you're going to find the keys. They're there. And they may be unique to you, but they're there. And then when you go to bed at night, go to bed with gratitude, even if it's that you have a bed. And that's all you have to be grateful for that night.
Boy, that
people a long way.
That is wonderful. I love that. The mindset is so important, and the gratitude, thankfulness, that is a profound part of healing. And this is a battle. You were through it for 20 years, and so many people are battling so brutal symptom patterns. And so it's hard, and you need that support and those encouragement words that you're sharing. So boy, I really thank you for joining us today, Beth. It's a lot of great information. I highly recommend people follow up with you. I've spent time going through some of those courses just for my own personal health issues, as well as a practitioner. How can I help patients, and how can I steer them to people like you? So take advantage of this, everyone. Beth, thank you again for just joining us here today and blessing us with your journey and what, the mess that you were in has become a great message. So thank you for sharing the message.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful we can partner to help more people get well faster.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. I hope you have a blessed day.